I always thought that after a few years of knitting, I would stop making mistakes. Turns out to just upgrade to more sophisticated mistakes, the kind where you absolutely know better and you still do them anyway. If you have ever thought this will probably be fine while knitting, this video is for you, so get comfy and let's dive in. Hi and welcome to today's video. My name is Luisa, but people call me Lu. And today we are talking about beginner knitting mistakes, but not the classic ones like dropping a stitch or twisting stitches. These are the mistakes I make because I am an optimistic or impatient or because I really want something to work. Lately, I've been finding myself diving headfirst into some knitting habits I used to be so good at avoiding, but now they seem like they are here to stay. Some of these are technical, some are emotional, and some are just me being a little delusional about time. I have 4 different categories of mistakes. The first one is who I think I am as a knitter, then me ignoring evidence, me avoiding reality mid-project, and the last one would be me against time and memory. So if you do any of this, you are in excellent company. And let's start with the one I think most of us do at least once. And my number one mistake in the who I think I am as a knitter category is choosing patterns on a whim instead of checking wardrobe fit. I shop patterns like I don't already own clothes. I have duplicate silhouettes, duplicate colors, although when it comes to colors, I think this is harder to avoid after a while. I like knitting statement pieces, or at least what I consider a statement piece, and I absolutely don't know how to style them. Anything more than a hand knit sweater with a nice pair of jeans, some white sneakers, a little French tuck, and a belt, I cannot handle. This is my peak styling knowledge. I don't know how to do anything more than that. It doesn't even have to be a true statement piece. A regular stockinette sweater or this really pretty lacy one I'm wearing today. I have absolutely no idea how to style it, but at the same time I think that's okay. I've been trying to learn what I actually reach for in terms of silhouettes and types of knits. Like, do I prefer to wear a sweater or a cardigan? What I like when it comes to neck accessories. I fall in love with garments, not outfits. A beautiful sweater doesn't always mean a wearable sweater. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes not so much. In my case, I find especially hard to find nice ways to wear shawls and scarves. If you've been here a while, you know my drama when it comes to wearing any kind of neck accessories. And lately, I've been itching to cast on a sequin dress, but I have nowhere to go that would require a sequin dress, but it's something that makes my eyes shine when I'm browsing for new patterns. I want to cast on projects for a fantasy life version of me. I think that's the best way to describe this whole dilemma. I knit for the life I imagine I live, not the one where I sit on my sofa like 70% of the time. Elegant knit is not a match for sofa life reality. I think I want to be a lace person when in reality I'm like a stockinette girl worked on 8mm needles with heavy duty yarn because I love to lie on the couch in the most weird positions known to men. That's the reality of my day-to-day life. But I love knitting with lightweight yarn on really small needles, so what can I do about it, right? I love the idea of being someone who wears delicate hand-wash knits daily, but I'm not that person. And maybe that's okay, and maybe that's why I go days without wearing any of my knits, which is something I so want to change in the future, but at least for now, I don't wear my knits daily. Sometimes I think I knit for my Pinterest self instead of my Tuesday afternoon self. You know what I mean? The person who spills tea on their pajama pants because they're too lazy to put it down while getting comfy on the couch. That's me. I worked on this gorgeous wrap cardigan last year that ended up absolutely perfect, but do I wear it? Nope. It's too much work to deal with all the ties to get everything looking right, and I'm a throw it on and I'm outdoor kind of girl, you know? So a wrap doesn't really fit into my wardrobe, but boy, I've wanted to knit a wrap for so long, and it was my most expensive project of 2025. So there's nothing wrong with aspiration knitting, but sometimes it is expensive learning, I would say. But that being said, I kind of want to cast on another wrap. It's for scientific purposes, okay? It's an experiment. I've been trying to restrain myself from casting on a new wrap, but I don't know what future me will decide. So now let's jump to my second mistake, which is assuming things will probably be fine. This will probably be fine is my most dangerous knitting thought. I used to be better at this, but lately I've been tipping more and more into optimism chaos, is how I would describe it. I suffer from this a lot when it comes to sleeve length, especially. I always think it will block to my desired measurement, which is not always the case. So then sometimes I have to go back to fix it, but sometimes it is fine, which reinforces the behavior. You know, yoke depth is always an issue for me. I almost always have to shorten it. So now when I cast on a new sweater, I'm already thinking of the changes I need to make to the pattern to shorten the yoke, and later on it ends up being too short, so I need to add length, which brings me to the original pattern measurements. This happened to me a couple of times last year, and it is so frustrating. And when I don't change anything regarding yoke depth, I later find myself doing some kind of sweater surgery to shorten the yoke. It's almost like I have enough experience to be dangerous. And sometimes I think I know better than the pattern. I used to be way better at this and always do a mid-project block, for example, to check the fit, the yoke depth and things like that, right after splitting for sleeves when it comes to yoke depth. But lately I've been skipping this step with no real reason for it. I have no idea why I am delaying a mid-project block. I think sometimes experience helps and sometimes confidence becomes chaos, and I think I'm dipping into this territory lately, which is kind of alarming for me. So now let's jump to the second category of knitting mistakes I make, which is me ignoring evidence. The first mistake in this category is swatching but emotionally ignoring results. When it comes to gauge, it's almost like a swatch for emotional support. You know, sometimes that's not always the case, but sometimes I think I want a yarn to work so badly that I just ignore data. That close enough thinking gets me every single time I do a swatch. You know what I'm talking about? That if I just give this swatch a little tug, I get to the pattern gauge, so it will all work out in the end. Or if it doesn't, it will be such a tiny difference that blocking will fix everything. I have this thought a lot. Last week I frogged 7 skeins worth of a sweater project because I just didn't want to acknowledge that it was too small and I needed to go up a size in the pattern. So now I have way more work ahead of me because I avoided that reality when it was time. I needed a gauge swatch, but I didn't want to register in my brain how off on gauge I was because I really wanted the yarn to work. So I guess I would say I swatch, I just don't always accept the results. Because listen, fabric lies, gauge lies, life lies. But I also want to see how a fabric behaves. That's one of the reasons why I always swatch for a new project. If I like the look of it, how the colors look next to each other and things like that, I think a swatch gives us very useful informations. But sometimes I want the yarn to be right more than it actually is. And I think this is a very human knitting behavior, okay? And there's also the whole swatching flat for projects knit in the round situation. Now, listen, there's one thing in life that is accuracy, and then there's convenience. I swatch like an optimist, I would say. I know there's a thing like tension differences between knits and purls, and a few different techniques for swatching in the round, but here's the thing. When it comes to my knitting, I don't really notice a difference between knits and purls when it comes to tension. I'm sure there is, but at least it's not enough to cause rowing out when I'm knitting flat. So in a ideal world, I would always swatch in the round if the project is knit in the round. But there's this thing called life and laziness. And most of the time, they win. So I swatch flat. And that's okay. Or not. When I find myself frogging an entire project because I chose the wrong size. So I guess that's not always okay. So I guess maybe this is me gambling slightly with physics. And sometimes I kind of want to take the risk anyway. I know sometimes it matters more, like when knitting color work or fitted garments. I don't usually knit fitted garments, so I guess that's why I am sometimes lazy with my swatches. With fitted garments, I think a gauge difference would maybe be more relevant. I don't know. So now let's go to my fourth mistake, which is getting a stitch gauge but ignoring row gauge. I don't know what row gauge is sometimes. I completely skip right past it. It's like an abstract thought, an abstract concept until our garment length gets weird, or in my case, the yoke depth or the sleeve length. That's when I realize row gauge is a thing. I am a very tight knitter, so I'm always off on gauge, which means I need way more rows to get the same length as the pattern, which sometimes comes in handy when I want to shorten the yoke depth, so sometimes that's kind of convenient. Being off on row gauge, I care about stitch gauge. Well, when I'm not lying to myself. And then I emotionally hope row gauge will sort itself out, you know? I think that's a common behavior, a common habit for many knitters out there. Because most of the time being off on gauge kind of works to my benefit since I like shorter yokes. And top-down sweaters are usually fairly easy to adjust length, so maybe that's why I don't really pay attention to row gauge. I guess this would be a huge problem if I worked on fitted garments also, but I don't, so yeah, that's what happens with me and my knitting. Row gauge is boring until my sweater hits my ribs instead of my waist. Yeah, that's what I think about row gauge. Or the neckline is so small that it doesn't get past my head. You know, I have learned this more than once, or maybe I didn't learn it because I still ignore row gauge most of the time. Yeah, who knows what goes inside here. So now let's go to my next mistake, which is measuring gauge once and calling it good. I think you can sense a pattern now in how many mistakes I have regarding gauge and swatches. But at the same time, I think you can all agree that one measurement feels emotionally correct, doesn't it? But textbook knitting tells us that swatches are not uniform, the edges lie. We should all measure in multiple spots. The edge stitches are not the same size as the center stitches. A yarn behaves differently across the swatch. Everybody knows this. Every experienced knitter knows this, but at the same time, one measurement is kind of enough, right? I mean, not really, but I think we all learn this the annoying way. But I still measure it only once and call it done. I know better. I just sometimes choose to ignore it, or I choose to find excuses as to why I have 2 or 3 stitch gauges in a single swatch. Like, oh, this one doesn't count because I was too close to my cast on edge. The other one is lying because the stitches look a little bit crooked. So let's assume this is the right one, and oh, look at that, I'm spot on gauge. Let's cast on. That's my reasoning when it comes to a gauge swatch. Now, enough about gauge swatches, and let's go to my third category of knitting mistakes, which is me avoiding reality mid-project. And the first mistake that fits this category is not trying on early enough. I wait until it looks like a sweater to emotionally prepare myself in case of a bad outcome. That's how I approach trying on a project, which basically means that if things don't look good, I have way more work ahead of me to rip back a big section of my project. It's kind of a crossroads where I gotta choose between avoiding bad news, which I kind of really like this approach of avoiding bad news, and saving time, so I have to choose between the two. I know which one I should choose, but it doesn't mean my mind agrees with me. Sometimes what happens in here, there's no arguing with it. It's a whole different person here, okay? Listen, sometimes denial is part of the knitting process, okay? A top-down project is so good for early try-ons, but I just don't do it often enough, I guess I would say. And I even try to reason with my own mind sometimes, saying, oh, there isn't enough fabric to get a good idea of the fit, so I should knit a couple more centimeters before I try it on. Because in my head, I try things on emotionally, okay, not physically. And sometimes that works, but that's also how I find myself frogging a sweater whip when I was almost done with the body to start over in another size. So, yeah, that's also a very possible outcome sometimes. I try things on when I am emotionally ready. That's my approach to trying things on. And sometimes, which is what happened with this sweater whip I'm talking about that I frogged, when I finally try it on and see something is wrong, I enter the denial knitting phase and I pretend I don't see the mistakes. I pretend I don't have to rip back, in this case, the entire project. I have that feeling that I need to knit extra rows, hoping things change, hoping feelings change, because I've already spent so much time on this whip. So let me just waste a couple more hours to make sure it is really that bad. You know, there's always a moment where I know, and then I need 10 more rows. So frogging and ripping back are part of the knitting process, at least my knitting process, and sometimes there's just no way around it. So now let's go to my fourth and final category of knitting mistakes, which is me against time and memory. My first mistake in this category is trusting I will remember things instead of writing notes. And future me is very overestimated, okay? I used to be so good at keeping notes on modifications I make to patterns, but lately my hand just refuses to write down how many rounds I need on the cuff before starting the second sleeve, or how many decreases I did to taper the sleeve. So some details become mysteries to solve later when I need information, so I guess present me somehow thinks future me is some sort of detective because I have to read my knitting to figure out what I actually did in the first sleeve, for example. I always think I will remember and I never remember. Past me leaves almost zero instructions, so it's always kind of a mystery to find out later on. Notes are so helpful to keep track of things, especially since I really like to experiment with my knitting and trying an over the top modification, which happens a lot, by the way. So I really should get back to writing notes. I think I would really be thankful for that later. So why did I stop taking notes? I have no idea. But if there's one mistake I make since my first day of knitting is underestimating how long a project will take. I plan knitting life like I have infinite free evenings. My plans are based on motivation, not reality. Okay? That's how my knitting works. My brain thinks I can cast on and finish, by the way, a sleeve in 2 days when in reality it takes me like 4 nights to finish a sleeve with how much knitting time I have per day. You know, sweaters are long relationships, I would say, but my brain refuses to accept that. In my head, every project is always a quick project. I can always finish any kind of project in 2 weeks. That's how I plan my knitting. So there's always something that I end up not casting on by the end of a season. I forget I knit in between having a whole life. I plan for peak knitting energy, and that does not exist every day. I guess it's the reality of my knitting time. Sometimes I just want to lie on the couch and watch a movie and have my knitting basket next to me for emotional support, you know? Not because I actually plan on picking my needles up to knit a few stitches. I just need the safe space my knitting basket provides. Sometimes this is very much true. So some days I get tons of knitting done, and some days it's like 3 stitches total. And I'm not even considering the scenario where I have to rip back some rows to fix a mistake, okay? I'm just talking perfect road knitting. I know how long things should take, I just still plan like everything will go perfectly. That's the reality of it. And it's okay for projects to take months or even years. I don't like it for me because lingering whips make me anxious, but that's a me problem. There's nothing wrong with a project that takes forever to finish if it still brings you joy. So slow projects are still successful projects. I don't think knitting speed has anything to do with knitting skill. These are two completely different concepts, but I think this talk is getting a little bit heavy now. We are just talking about mistakes and having fun with today's video. Alright, and those are the mistakes I find myself making over and over again. If you recognize yourself in any of this, welcome to the club. This is just part of being a person who makes things. Knitting is not about doing everything perfectly, it's about making things you love and learning what works for you over time. And honestly, I will probably make at least 3 of these mistakes again this year, if not more. If you ever catch yourself thinking this will probably be fine, just know I am somewhere around the road thinking the exact same thing. So thank you so much for watching and spending some time with me today. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe and ring the bell for more knitting content from yours truly. I will be back here next week with a fresh new video for you. And until then, happy knitting. Bye!